I'm Victoria Desmond. I'm just going to help field questions. I know most of you, but there's some of you I don't know. And I may actually ask, just for Jennifer's benefit, maybe you say who you are when you're asking the question. It might just not take so long. So thanks very much, Jennifer, and we'll just open it up to anyone who wants to jump in. It's that little moment. Hello, what's your name?
I'm Bruce Pond. I'm retired from Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry as a research scientist and adjunct in environmental and life sciences here. I'm interested in your distinction between citizen science and citizen sensing. My feeling is that most of citizen science, as it's called, is citizen sensing. But you did, so I'm interested in who your scientists are, or who your sensors are. How were those participants selected, and how did they, or did they self-select? And what kind of bias is there in representing the people of Deptford in the dust box participants?
With the distinction between citizen science and citizen sensing, clearly citizen scientists are sensing in the sort of more general sense of sensing, but the citizen sensing term arose in relation to digital technology. And I think it was actually a geographer, Michael Goodchild, in 2007, who talked about citizens as sensors, which is in relation to volunteered geographic information, VGI as it was called back then, so it's kind of slightly antiquated. He didn't coin the term citizen sensing as such, and then that term started to be used within HCI. I think it was the first place that I've seen a human-computer interaction where companies like Microsoft were talking about citizen sensing, and it was a particular way of talking about sensor technologies in the sense of ubiquitous computing, in the wiser sense, of how citizens would use these devices and how they would become part of these sensor networks, part of these smart cities. So it's that particular genealogy of sensing that I'm looking at here, which is not to say that citizen scientists aren't doing their own versions of sensing, but it's to look at the particular kinds of sensing capabilities that are meant to be enabled by these devices, real-time data, some of the claims that the James Reserve group were making about how these would be new macroscopes, like a microscope for understanding, subatomic, atomic, these would be macroscopes for understanding ecologies, because you'd be able to deploy them, because that was a collaboration between ecologists and computer scientists doing a test bed in the James Reserve in California, so that they could see processes as they were unfolding basically 24/7 throughout the year, and that would be a new way of gathering ecological data rather than going out with your clipboard, for a few weeks, and that would be just sort of your data set. You'd have this continuous, gigantic, big data set, and that would allow for new insights into environmental processes. So it's that kind of way of understanding what sensing is meant to be able to do that I'm trying to work with. And again, I think things like citizen science, where you're doing backyard bird counts or various projects like that, are different than citizen sensing. So that's the distinction that I'm making. With how people are selected, that's very much because they're already monitoring. So the way the research was set up was to look for community groups and individuals who were already undertaking monitoring and were invested in those practices in relation to particular concerns and campaigns that they had, and to understand those through interviews, field work, various kind of site visits with them, and then and to document those practices, and then to begin to work in a more participatory way, to do collaborative research, to develop a toolkit that they would then use and see how they develop that. So we worked in Pennsylvania in relation to fracking, and groups there were monitoring air because they were concerned about water, and they started to monitor air, and they had a whole number of instruments they were using. And similarly here, people were monitoring in relation to the super sewer and also to a major roads project, the Silvertown Tunnel, and so major kind of infrastructure projects. They were putting up diffusion tubes, for instance, which are these small plastic tubes that you affix to lampposts, typically about 2 meters high, and they have a kind chemical reactive paper, and they will tell you how much NO2, nitrogen dioxide, is in an area over a kind of 4-week sample period. But again, that's not real-time data. So people are interested very much in the real-time data and seeing what's kind of happening at any given moment, and also being involved in that kind of data process and knowing what their data is producing. You mentioned bias. I don't know if that is in a way suggesting that people would then be biased in how they do their monitoring? Or?
No, it wasn't clear to me how the people who participated with the dust boxes were selected, whether you chose them with a spatial sampling design in mind, you located them and found tenure for your boxes in these places, or whether you went to the citizenry and said, we're doing this project, do you want to join us, and you can collect data and you can analyze it.
It was the latter, and when people felt there was somewhere interesting to monitor, they would often network within their community and find someone who could host a dust box. And we also had the dust boxes available for free checkout in the library that I showed. So anyone could go and pick one up as well. Yeah.
Mike.
I was wondering if I could ask you to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the two halves of your talk, and you gestured to that this is a very different half now, and it seemed like in the first one you referenced Whitehead and you referenced the electronic skin and these new forms of agency that we might start to recognize that were already there, or these new forms that might emerge, and it was, I mean, a conventional generic way of putting it was sort of the theoretical half, and then in the second half we saw this great story about the boxes and about the community engagement, and I was thinking about the kind of civic agency that came out of this way of doing sensing, and at the end it was, you know, so strikingly different from the beginning, because at the end it was this very familiar kind of like we got the data, we told the paper about it, now an MP is raising hell in Parliament, right? And that I personally don't have a problem with that structure, but like that form of, it seems like that form of agency seemed like my first thought was that seems like the old form of agency, not like the new ones I was thinking about in the first half of the talk. But maybe there is something new behind that because of the means of the ways of sensing. Anyway, I was just wondering if you could bridge that.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question, and in the newer work I'm doing, I draw on Isabel Stengers, who talks about empowerment. Because empowerment is something I'm very critical of, I guess. The way that empowerment is rendered within a lot of digital participation scenarios, the smart city and so on, that citizens will have these sensors, they'll be able to sense environments, and then they'll realize political change. It's the kind of thing I was talking about earlier in critiquing. And what she talks about is how we might empower a situation. So that a situation is giving the people who would gather there the power to invent and think and create. So, I mean, that is the sort of agency, whether it's agency, the sort of political engagement that I think this work is trying to work towards. And of course, she's a very close reader of Whitehead and is very informed by him in her own thinking. Well, Whitehead was not someone who discussed politics really as such in her works. I think Stengers is a kind of thinker who has brought his work into that space to create kind of considerations for how we might be engaged in politics, but we're reconstituting the way we think about subjects that might be realizing political change and the ways that they go about that. And so one of the things we've done with the fracking work is suggest that this is a move from citizen sensing to collective monitoring. And it's a different way of even thinking about and parsing how sensors end up being used by people when they're trying to address environmental problems. It's less this kind of commercial scenario where people are managing their own individual exposure, which there are plenty of sensor products that have that as their strapline for how they try to sell their products. And that could be discussed, I think, at great length. We've only really skimmed the surface of that particular aspect. But another side to these is that they can be put to use in relation to people's concerns about environments and create these kind of community monitoring infrastructures. which also create different kinds of situations. They empower situations that people can raise their concerns in a different way. And while certainly this is being taken to Parliament, it's not to say that that's a linear process of realizing change, because it continues to be a problem in the area. When Vicky Foxcroft raised that in Parliament, Andrea Leadsom, said, well, that's the air quality problem, and that was kind of the end of it. So I wouldn't say that that also was a kind of direct realization of change. It was an attempt to bring something into a space of political conversation, but it wasn't the end of it either. That story kind of goes on.
Yeah, well, I sort of imagine that that's what's going to be interesting. We invent the internet, we call it pages and scrolls because we're still we have this new technology, but the first thing we do with it is the old stuff, right? And I wonder if, well, it'll just be interesting to see what they do subsequently, especially when they hit these roadblocks.
And I also wouldn't want to suggest that it's the censors that are enabling the political change as such. I certainly wouldn't want to kind of suggest this techno fix, as it were, because within this work, we're quite critical, and I'm quite critical of these narratives of how technologies are meant to be able to realize change. And it's often the case that community organizing has been a kind of key way in which censors have kind of become more interesting devices, as it were. Because the narratives are quite simplistic, and people use them in all sorts of ways that kind of run counter to what a computing company might use to sell them. So it's also not to suggest that that is kind of distinctly deterministic relationship. But yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question because I think it's a site of ongoing study. What are these forms of political engagement? How do they rework agency if they do? Do political processes change? If so, how? And how are those delimited? And so I'm writing a new book called Citizens of Worlds, which is trying to work with some of these questions around new forms of citizenship and political engagement. So it's very much, percolating, but still not resolved.
I'm just going to jump in with a question while people are formulating more thoughts to follow up also. The thing again, obviously there's different ways of doing talks when you're starting out with the theoretical kind of engagement you have. But I was actually very struck by the idea you said in 2008, there was more computers like talking to each other or sensors talking to each other than people talking to each other. So one of the things I sort of was intrigued by is that if you wanted to talk about that a bit more, because you then moved into the sort of thing of people really engaging in community projects. But what is the implication actually of the fact that one can bypass the human altogether?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and probably why so many people are now engaged with questions of machine learning and AI and so on, is how human agency is being reconstituted and the extent to which that's creating all sorts of social, political, and ethical concerns. And would be a whole other study, I think, to look at how sensors, through their kind of machinic communication systems, are making all sorts of decisions, for instance, about smart cities, that people might not be involved with really very closely. I tried to hint at that in the very last chapter of Program Earth in a kind of smart city text where I go to this smart building, the Crystal, which is a Siemens building in London, and how it really is a kind of meant to be a self-regulating building, and see that as a microcosm of what the self-regulating city is meant to become. But I think it, will require much more research to get into these infrastructures, to get into, systems, to understand how they're working, the decisions that they're making, who's decided that that's how a city should function in relation to its infrastructure, what are the effects for different people. And so
but you're saying there's this technological imaginary about this smart city, which is like you start from scratch, but there are these fantasies people have, sort of technological utopianism about the machines just taking over. So let's not have people driving cars, let's have cars driving themselves, and let's kind of, organize the world because actually the computers are better, And so there's some way in which this sensor stuff, the actual technology, allows for I mean, the little experiments you showed actually bring it all down to a human size. But the scenario you give us is not a human-sized scenario. It's a kind of global scenario of all these sensors sort of talking to each other. All these computers,
Yeah.
the whole computational universe sort of just be doing without the human altogether. So.
And I think this is one of the tensions within these sensing imaginaries and projects, is the extent to which they would like to be global projects or master planning projects in a kind of, starting from scratch, but at the same time are appropriating a kind of rhetoric of democratic engagement in order to basically sell smart cities projects, for instance, and to suggest that they will enable greater citizen engagement. And one has to wonder the extent to which those make-believe scenarios are part of that larger sales pitch of bringing it down to the human scale is part of a way to try to make the machine more intimate, familiar, and effective, so that people are enrolled and kind of engaged and invested in those technologies in different ways. So I think, it cuts both ways, and it can never sort of be a singular narrative in that respect, which is kind of interesting but also troubling, because then do you become part of the sales pitch if you're working on sensors and making them potentially palatable in different ways? Is that true for anyone working on digital technology? How do you kind of occupy that space when it is very much the kind of terrain of these large technology companies?
So I have a couple of thoughts. I'll do them all. I was just thinking, like, in London, or southeast London, where you were, I guess, did you get any space dust?
Did we get any?
Space dust. Apparently, there's like thousands of pounds of space dust come in every year.
No, that's really interesting. We didn't do speciation. So speciation is when you actually look at what's in the particles. Although we did look at doing DIY speciation, but we realized we were probably biting out more than we could chew. But I think that would be very interesting.
Which is beside the point. I just wondered.
Yeah, no, that would be really.
The thing I was thinking is, while I was listening, was partly, like you mentioned Sputnik and Blue, and the fact of, the start of ecology, and that there's a way of looking at the beginnings of ecology, and that's one of them, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, Sputnik went up in, 57? And that was the same as the International Geophysical Year, first International Geophysical Year. And like the USSR was working with America collaboratively on environmental and atmospheric studies, because after the Second World War, they were like, we don't understand any of the phenomena we saw, what's the atmosphere? So like, it was an international project to like do just this type of sensing, but it was in its early days, right? And that was government actors, that was like government bodies, but now we're doing this individually, and like that's a different angle. But I was thinking about the dust box in particular because at home there's a gold mine, and there's a tailings pond, and there's dust monitors all around the town. And so you see them, you gotta go check them, you gotta do stuff. It's very similar to what you did with different applications of dust box. Like, these are silly looking things. Those are kind of interesting. It's like, that's like company data though. If you think we have Environment Canada, we have like other things, like you said in 2008, the connectivity of machines or programs with each other outpaced like people communicating with machines and doing this. Right now we've got like individuals who are doing this, like your initiative, and you've got companies who own the data. There's a ton of data with the Internet of Things. You also have governments still doing it. So there's like, it's not a redundancy, but there's like a lot of different sources of this investigation going on right now. And so I wouldn't suggest it would be a redundancy situation, because this is an engagement and the potential for anything to come from that. Who knows? Supplements, if anything, the fact the government's already doing it, and it, like the corporate side is just they just own that data. They do whatever they want with it, right? But in a strange sense, I wonder about the political economy of like the fact of the dust boxes and the fact of citizen engagement on this kind of individual basis, because I remember things like, this entire area is not being fished by Antarctica and South America. We just don't fish there. But we're going to go and we're going to send trawlers in to fish for scientific purposes. So it's not like a non-involvement thing. There's always the angle to the observation, right? And it was kind of covered by some of the earlier discussion, but the idea of encouraging the sort of sensing, the sort of citizen sensing. How do you ideally see it fitting with the fact of the Internet of Things and the corporate and the government sense of the data already being, all these sensors already operating together? Like, are you going to try and mesh it, or?
Yeah, no, the question of the different types of data is really interesting, and it's something that emerged as a kind of central concern in this project, really starting with the fracking study, where citizen data plays all kinds of different roles. So you might have a situation where you do have a monitoring infrastructure, like in London, but in Pennsylvania, there aren't monitors in those areas, because monitors tend to be in sites where there are urban populations of 100,000 people or more. So the rural locations are not being monitored, and also because of the energy policy passed in 2005, the Halliburton loophole in the States, the fracking is not really being monitored for clean air or water. It's really down to self-reporting. So you don't have a considerable amount of state or federal oversight, so there's an absence of governmental data there. You have the companies, the operators, self-reporting, and that's usually not based on actual emissions, that's based on estimates and models. So there, the citizen data is playing a very particular role, which is in response to the sense of an absence of data, of documenting something that's not being documented. So that's one way in which data is produced. In the case of London, where there is a certain amount of monitoring going on, there aren't really monitors, regulatory monitors, in this location in Deptford. There's one down the road in New Cross Gate, but that whole area that I showed on the map is without a regulatory monitor. And then the monitors that I did show for the super sewer, the residents have not been able to get access to that data, even though that data is meant to be supplied to the council to show that the air quality targets are being met for the development. So in a way, it's meant to be in the interest of the public, but it's not being made public because they don't want to have to deal with those kind of PR issues, I guess, when there's a breach. So there you do start to see very different patterns when you have 30 monitors concentrated in a spatially dense area, and you start to see things like river pollution. I don't know of any LAQN monitoring that's on the river. And now the Port Authority of London is saying, yes, we recognize we do have a problem with air pollution. You also see very particular patterns around traffic intersections, because you might have multiple clusters in an area. You see that garden spaces make a big difference. That's not the sort of attention to data that you'll get from a London Air Quality Network infrastructure, because that's looking at whether targets are met, whether the EU air quality objective is met. So the data is also being collected for a very particular purpose in the regulatory sense, and also in the corporate sense. You know, they're trying to meet targets. They're sharing their data or not. With the citizen data, it's deployed in relation to particular concerns about the urban fabric, studying those closely, and looking at those patterns and revealing things that actually aren't being revealed through those other forms of data. So I would say there are different insights that are emerging, and different ways in which the data is being leveraged, and it's different ways of creating evidence as well. So that, I mean, I have a foot in science and technology studies, or STS, so those are concerns that are key to that area. The politics of expertise, who can make what claims with what data, how does that inform the sort of worlds that are made? It gets down to kind of world making and the stories that are created, and then what does that mean, you know, for the way that people are able to be connected to their environments, and so on. So, yeah.
Jim?
I'm Jim Conley, retired sociologist. I have a question about the relation, you mentioned, you were asked about the relation between citizen science and citizen sensing. My question tries to go back to the question about global sensors and the more local citizen activism that you were talking about. And the connection that I see as a possibility here is what may be called public science or public data. That is, just for an example, my son works for something called Ocean Networks Canada, which is all these sensors off the west coast that gather tons of oceanographic data, and the data is public. You register, you can access it on the web. How does that link into this whole network of machines, humans, experts, citizens, and activism on what is kind of the key problem of our time, namely climate change?
Is that the Ocean Network where they had the teenager who spotted the hagfish?
Yes, it probably was.
Yeah, no, that's, so I've
because
looked
they
at that
have
one.
this video.
I've looked at their data, it's very extensive. And this is a key way in which there's so much data that's now being made public, and people are meant to be able to use that data in particular ways. If they have APIs, you can bring it in and do various things. So we brought in the London Air Quality Network has an API. So we bring in the regulatory monitors so people can look at their data against the LAQN data. So you can do those sorts of things with the data, and I think that is really interesting. It raises all kinds of questions, I think, at the same time, of who is able to undertake those practices and in relation to what kinds of questions and concerns that they're trying to mobilize in relation to environments or in relation to exploiting environments, because that data could also be used for different kinds of purposes depending on what it's showing. And then also I would say, it's a question of how environments are potentially turned into informational problems. So this is something that other people like Kim Fortune have written about. The informating of environmentalism is a phrase that she's coined. How environments are consistently sort of turned into data-based problems, so that if you can document the problem of climate change, for instance, and you have enough evidence to be able to show that temperatures are rising in relation to CO2, then you'll be able to act on that problem. So that's a very particular way of configuring a relationship to environments and environmental problems, and also the actors who would act on them, that are data-enabled actors, one could say. And so that, I would say that is a kind of consideration. It's not to say that we should dispatch and dispense with all forms of information, but it's to consider how that has become a very dominant way of engaging with environments. And I've been at many sort of scientific meetings where the problem has been put as, we just need more data. If only we could get more sensors out and then we could get more data, then we'll know how to address this. And one has to wonder at what point that problem of data has to be turned into a kind of socio-political engagement from the get-go, so that different kinds of situated investments in data, like I guess the ones that I'm showing here with the urban sensing, are structuring the problem of data collection already in relation to these entangled lived problems, and with an eye to how to shift that situation. So that's a different way of thinking about expertise as well, and the role that data plays, so that the politics of expertise might shift rather than scientists deploying their instruments and collecting the objective data for others to look at and become aware about what's going on in environments. People are invested in their data collection undertakings and perhaps bringing in other data sets and having the ability to do that to respond to very particular questions and concerns.
I have a very intelligent question. I have some rumblings in the skull that sort of play off of what Mike was asking about in terms of returning to models, to older models, even though we're dealing with newer ideas and newer potentials, but also dealing with what Victoria was talking about in terms of making this palatable. So there's, like, so the sensors, like I've been dealing with the aesthetics, I'm thinking, as you began speaking, about the aesthetic of the sensors. And they are palatable, and what you are doing is basically what you were discussing in the first bit for Wiseman and making invisible the infrastructure again, in ways that is palatable, because we don't want these garish sensing machines inside of our houses or under our barbecues or by our cats. We want these cute little nodes. Can I call them nodes? I don't know what to call them, but what these cute little things that we can have in our environments, which is interesting as well. But then I start to wonder if this is just further aestheticizing big data and making big data palatable. And then I wonder what do you do from there? Like, how can you actually turn that again into making it something that's problematic, and you're questioning, you're criticizing. It's not a word. That's a word. Close enough. You know what I mean. So again, like, what is the engagement with? For me, it's less of like that direct political engagement, but more of the idea of art aesthetic. To take it from the warning that Benjamin gave about just aestheticizing everything which depoliticizes it, is there a way of aestheticizing something that repoliticizes it? Is that a question?
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, the actual look and feel of these devices, we didn't go for an invisible, visible binary, I guess. But we did think about the materiality of the devices as something that was important and was tied to this location in Southeast London. It's a kind of gritty urban environment. It has a history of activism, punk, DIY. Those are all very much part of the character of the place. So these particles formed, these black particles formed as part of, you know, an expression, I guess, of the identity of the place, and people did become attached to them and didn't want to have to give them up, and they referred to them as pets rather than nodes, but or creatures of various kinds. So that, I mean, that was interesting, and I think if you had a plastic box, would you have necessarily felt the same way about the data in the projects? I don't know. I mean, I guess you could do that comparative testing if you're interested in that sort of research. But I think, you know, it came out of the participatory process too, which is, you know, kind of the key aspect to it. It wasn't just, oh, let's make this handsome device. You know, it was from working with the communities and understanding their histories and their identities and their commitments, and making an object that was very much part of that place and that environment. So it's kind of becoming environmental computation that included those material aesthetic effective registers. Yeah, so I would say that was important to the kind of political engagement. That also wasn't the kind of usual idea of an aesthetic as coming from an individual auteur. Again, it's this kind of attempting to empower a situation and gathering, inventing and gathering through those collective practices. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's a very particular, perhaps, approach to what might be understood as aesthetic as well.
John Peckett, I used to teach cultural studies here for many years. Really admire your work and I appreciate the talk today. I'm sort of tugging away at the same threads here as everybody else. And trying to put the different sides of this kind of picture together as it keeps tugging apart. I mean, the big data side of it, the Internet of Things, is kind of tugging away towards the science fictional end of things, and the citizen sensor issue goes back to these kind of legacy concerns about kind of liberal utopia, citizenship, autonomy, agency, all this kind of stuff, where unless we're post-humanist extremists, we would like the big data, like the computational aspects of ecology of sense to work to our purposes, and in some sense to its human interests. So it seems like, as we presented, it looks like there's always these two sides. There's a knowledge side to this, where you've got this Internet of Things, millions of objects that are sensing things, registering stimuli, generating signals that eventually become, through a series of transformations of protocols, meaningful data, big data. And then that's the knowledge side that's kind of presented a kind of constructivist framework where we're actually not just reading off an objective environment, but creating it in the process of registering, signaling, transforming, interpreting data. On the other side, we've got the pragmatic or the action side of it, where all of this data, once meaningfully interpreted, triggers responses and triggers actions of some kind, which in the kind of technological concept of the data, big data would be more and more automated because it all operates in a kind of speed that requires some kind of automation, which again would be operated through a series of protocols that would, initiate the appropriate kind of action or response to the data that's being taken in. Now it seems that both sides now, as an intervention within that second increasingly automated processing of action, you have a concept of a citizen intervention, which is in localities where it's possible to do this. Now it seems to me that both of these operations, the knowledge side of it and the activation of responses to it, both are operated through algorithms. And I was wondering if you would say something about this appearance of this new concept of the algorithm on both sides of this kind of equation, and the extent to which that would be increasingly operated by probably artificial intelligences, which would be able to respond to it with the kind of speed, with the kind of scale or scope that it really requires. I'm reminded by this kind of fundamental McLuhan insight that any new technology, as it shapes and massages us, changes the scale and the pace and the pattern of everything. I mean, on the planetary and on the human basis. So I'm very interested in what you might say about how you see the kind of the role of these algorithms on both sides of this, and in particular how you would then see the citizen aspect of this sustained and intervening with this production and operational kind of algorithmic technological utopia.
Yeah, no, the question of the algorithm is an interesting one because there is this sort of fascination of almost obsession with them within contemporary discourse. And one person said to me once that it's not really the algorithms that matters so much as the data, because it's the data that the algorithms are trained on that makes them have the particular kind of biases that they do. And I think that is quite interesting because algorithms do settle into a particular form and they do have particular biases, but at the same time they're trained on data sets that allow them to take that shape. So I think there's something about understanding them as part of the larger media ecology and not only as these sort of free-floating objects that perhaps could be seen to be having a more deterministic effect. And so while it's important to kind of zero in on them, perhaps not to look at them in isolation. So I think that raises the question then of how perhaps citizen data could be an interesting way in which to train algorithms. That could be a whole project right there to look at how potentially to set to work. You've just given me an idea for another project. Kind of alternative, could you democratize algorithms? Are they necessarily deterministic entities? Are there ways of continually tweaking them? Whether it's through introducing new data that they might be trained on or other processes. But I do think this kind of big data question which came up as well, which I didn't answer so much, it's an interesting one because I think there also might be a tendency with algorithms and big data to kind of see them in this monolithic, potentially kind of slightly sort of controlling way. And we argue that the citizen data makes a different kind of big data. It's not big in the usual way of having these massive volumes, but it is big for citizen data to have 5 million data points, for instance. And what do you do with that? And how does that create different kinds of capacities when you have all of that data, and then you can go to a regulator and say particular things about what's happening in an environment. So I wonder about these terms and whether we almost give them too much power, whether we let them have too much of that kind of, sort of dark magic, as it were. And we should potentially crack them open, work with them in these messy ways, these messy kind of experimental ways like we're attempting to do with this sensor work, and see how they might be put to work in different ways. That's kind of what we're trying to do with sensors is, well, we're kind of critically understanding the rhetoric that goes with sensors. We're also using them to see what other ways they might unfold in the world. I think you could do that with algorithms, and we've attempted also to do that with big data. And part of that is about creating practices that are able to kind of kick back against the ways in which these monolithic narratives and industries have formed, because we are living in quite a kind of technocratic time, which is having consequences for political and democratic life. And as you mentioned, we have these kind of outdated notions of the citizen and liberal autonomy and so on that really do need updating and reworking. And what are the kind of best ways to do that? I think some of these practice-based approaches could be potentially quite generative for engaging with what are really troubling technologies, but then also trying to hack them, rework them, and create different kinds of technical engagements. And they might not end up looking the same at the end. They might not look like sensors or algorithms or big data. They might not even seem to necessarily fit within those categories, like the smart city. Could you still call that a smart city when you have all of those sensors distributed in Deptford? Is that a smart city, or does that not qualify as a smart city because it hasn't been generated by Labellium or Intel or Google, for that matter, since just down the road you have your own sidewalk labs fiasco going on right now. So it's interesting to see how people inhabit, occupy, change, whether they're able to these various kinds of figures like the algorithm, big data, smart city, Internet of Things, and create different kinds of technical imaginaries and technical worlds.
But insofar as they're all involved with some form of selection from kind of massive data and from a repertoire of possible actions, and insofar as they involve very large-scale algorithmic engineering, really to operate that so it's fast enough and rapid enough to figure the kinds of actions that you want if you actually want to have a smart city that works. I'm wondering how much this kind of algorithmic engineering over time is embedded in millions of pages of code, let's say, is available for kind of an ad hoc intervention. As it gets sedimented, as its basic purposes may be forgotten with time, it becomes more and more machine operated. So, what kind of citizen engagement do we need to generate as this grows up, so that we have some degree of ability to intervene effectively, or not intervene isn't the right word because it separates the thing from it, but to be part of this process in a way that is, sort of kind of proves that's meaningful for us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a key and brilliant question. I think that's what many people working in digital technology are grappling with. What does it mean to have these systems that are becoming so pervasive and so monolithic in many cases, and so difficult to kind of shift in their trajectory, and citizens in whatever form, as they're forming, as they're previously formed, as they might still be yet to realize, are kind of shifting in that space, and it's difficult to make inroads. Politicians are having difficulty sort of understanding and grappling with that. And I think it is a massive concern now of how to work in that space. It's a question of how to deal with that when you have Google, you have Palantir, you have Facebook, the list goes on and on. If you want to start to look at these Silicon Valley companies and what they're up to. I've written I'm in this funny little space right now because I've written a speculative fiction piece on Palantir for this collection on smart cities. And the question is whether to kind of publish it or not, because Palantir itself is so powerful. that you almost wonder whether you would draw the wrong kind of attention, as it were. But I mean, some of the things that they've done, they're working with the LAPD to be able to monitor and surveil people. They're using these very sophisticated data analytics systems to connect up basically your social networks. Obviously they've used it for terrorism, they continue to use it for terrorism investigations. It formed through a InQtel CIA spin-off, so and now they're using it for smart cities and looking at ways of doing data analytics of social networks in urban locations, tying it up to urban data of all sorts. So the ability to have interoperability with those data sets is kind of massive, and the things you can find out about people and what's going on in any given urban environment, it's quite considerable. And I don't think many people really realize what some of these, people are familiar with Google and Facebook, but some of these more shadowy companies, they're up to some very curious work, and it has real consequences for how we live in the world. I think I don't have a definitive answer, because I think really nobody does right now, at least not that I've read. Maybe you know, but I think this is what we're grappling with. And I watched the select committees about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and Facebook, and it's mind-boggling how. But I think we can only sort of continue to grapple with the problems and continue to experiment with different forms of political engagement and keep pushing away at something that is so troubling.
So last question, or second last question, end of the world, climate change. My question is basically to return to the question about climate change. What is the possibility that citizen sensing, the deployment of sensors by citizens, can play here, if any? And my initial concern is that the collection of any data at all by anyone at this point is not going to help anyone. It's going to slowly delay things in a localized fashion, and maybe that makes things a little bit better for a generation or two, but doesn't ultimately change where the planet is headed. And that this collection of data is encouraging what would otherwise be more direct political action, that we don't need any more numbers. We haven't needed any more numbers for a few decades now. What we need is to, shut down the tar sands, do whatever it takes. So that's the pessimistic look at things. So I'm hoping you can give me cause for optimism. What role can citizen sensing, can this sort of dispersal of data collection play in those larger, bigger picture problems?
I think that is a real concern, and I've written a chapter on energy and this concept of electronic environmentalism that I coined, where we might just be monitoring the crisis as we create it, sort of thing. And I think that is a danger with, and it gets to the kind of question earlier about how to work with different kinds of data sets. How do we form relationships to data where it can be organized within certain kinds of practices? So if you wanted to shut down the tar sands, are there forms of data collection and data practices that might be a part of that? Not determining it as such, but could be interesting forms of evidence for undertaking those projects. So I think it's not a kind of either-or scenario that you either monitor or you do political action, but perhaps it's about how those start to inform each other in ways that they remake what they're doing, and they proliferate different ways of doing data collection, as I was mentioning earlier, and also different ways of thinking about political action. One of the things with the fracking that people, the reason why they got involved in the project is they were interested in hard data, because they felt with hard data, then the state and federal regulators would have to listen to them, and the operators would have to make changes. And that was based on years of campaigning, of trying to get various things changed within the way that development was occurring. So, that came out of political struggles, that interest in hard data. That wasn't just kind of superfluous to the process. So I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that, we don't need that data in some ways, but I think also there is this kind of problem of turning the environment into an informational problem where it's just about collecting more and more data. So again, it's kind of how they push at each other and remake each other. This kind of question of data in practice. And as we kind of discussed earlier, we need new political practices. We need to kind of think of this as a creative space of experimentation where it is forming new environments and new individual subjects, citizens or otherwise. Perhaps there are new terms yet to be invented since citizen is so loaded, and new kinds of collective potential. So I would say that's all to play for rather than to necessarily exclude and discard and say it's kind of relic to do monitoring, because there's all kinds of things that are coming out of monitoring all the time. So yeah, I think one caveat there obviously is all of the infrastructure that's needed to do it. It's electronic infrastructure, and it has considerable carbon footprints and other kinds of footprints as well. The minerals needed and so on. It kind of gets back to my earlier work, but with the Internet of Things chapter as well, rethinking the Internet of Things, one of the things I look at is what does it mean to have this whole infrastructure that potentially have to be upgraded every 18 months to 2 years. We made these dust boxes and they probably lasted for about 2 years in terms of their internals. And so now what to do with those electronics. And if you think about that at scale, because this is a small ad hoc project, what does it mean to have sensors at scale in infrastructures that are continually becoming obsolete? And not just the sensors, their extended infrastructures, the platforms, and all of the kind of interfaces that they connect up to. So it might also be a matter of thinking about how we do monitoring, and how that isn't necessarily have to be kind of tech-heavy enterprise. Yeah.
Is there anyone else burning to ask an immediate question? Because if not, just before I thank Jennifer, I just want to say we are at the end. There's a cash bar and there'll be some munchies over there, and you can have something to eat and drink and ask questions in person. But we'd like to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.